Hello everyone. The title of today's lesson is Documentary Film. Documentary film is a major subgenre of the larger category of the cultural produce called cinema. Actually, we can say for sure that the proper cinema began with documentary films, which in the early history of cinema were called actualities. A documentary film is also known as non-fiction film, actuality film, interest film, or educational film. It's believed that the word documentary in the context of cinema studies was coined by the Scottish documentary filmmaker John Grierson in 1926 to refer to the Canadian filmmaker Robert Flaherty's film Mona, which was released in the same year. Mona is an actuality film about the traditional life the Polynesians living in Samoa in Savoy Island, situated in the South Pacific Ocean. John Grierson is one of the pioneering figures who made and theorized the documentary mode of cinema. Both the British and the Canadian documentary film traditions were fathered by John Grierson. He says that the French first used the word documentary to mean travelogue. Grierson elaborates, I quote, "So far as we have regarded all films made from natural material as coming within the category, the use of natural material has been regarded as the vital distinction of the documentary film, where the camera shot on the spot in that fact was documentary," unquote. In the opinion of Eric Barno, from 1874 to 1895, embryo documentaries with the duration of 3 to 4 seconds were shot by inventors like Pierre Janson, Edward Muybridge, Jules Marie, Thomas Alva Edison, and so on. In 1874, Pierre Jules Janson, a French astronomer, recorded a series of individual shots of the passing of the Venus across the Sun using photographic plates loaded in an improvised photographic camera, which was later called revolver photographic. This is the first step in the beginning of motion picture or movie. In 1895, with the invention of the Lumiere cinematography device, the proper cinema began, that too in a documentary mode. Learning objectives of this module are to enable the learner to understand and describe documentary film, comprehend various types of documentary films, differentiate a documentary film and a fiction film, understand the various approaches to documentary filmmaking, and critically analyze and appreciate master documentary filmmakers and their documentary films. Documentary or non-fiction films are defined in various ways by different theoreticians. John Grierson defined documentary films as, I quote, "the creative treatment of actuality," unquote. This definition foregrounds the argument that just by shooting a real event or real person will not make the film a documentary film. In addition to shooting a real event or real people, mostly in an unaware situation, the filmmaker has to give a creative touch to the actual shots in the form of presentation or editing or rearranging the actual shot footages. It's in this creative or artistic treatment given to the actual shots makes it a documentary film, which is a work of art. Patricia Afterhead says that, quote, documentaries are about real life. They are not real life. They are not even windows onto the real life. They are portraits of real life, using real life as their raw material, constructed by artists, technicians who make myriad decisions about what stories to tell, to whom, and for what purpose, unquote. Problematizing the ever-fluid, non-fixed, and ever-expanding nature of the cinematic subgenre documentary film, Dave Saunders says that, quote, it should be noted that documentary in the intellectually contested canon and at the less discussed margins comprises a vast, diverse, and non-linear matrix of films not easily given to precise genealogical or evolutionary explication, unquote. We can call Pierre Janssen's revolver photographic record of the Venus crossing the Sun, Edward Muybridge's photographic series of the Galloping Horse, Jules Mary's capturing of a falling cat with the gun photography, etc., as proto-documentary films. With the invention of the cinematography, which was a camera cum projector device by the French brothers Louis Lumière and Auguste Lumière in 1895, the proper documentary films began to be produced. The first 10 films of Lumière brothers, screened in the first ever ticketed public screening of films held on 28 December 1895 at the Grand Café Hotel in Paris, can be called the first actuality films or first generation documentary films. Here is the list of Louis Lumiere's first 10 silent French actualities or silent documentary films with their corresponding English titles. Let's now watch 3 early actualities made by the Lumière brothers. One of the many methods to understand a documentary film is to juxtapose it with its imaginary counterpart, the fiction film. A fiction film is an imagined narrative with an artistically concocted story of invented characters acted out by professional impersonators in a set location with a pre-designed ending. A fiction film can be called a celluloid novel. However, we can say that documentary films are like literary essays with some factual materials to discuss. What are the major differences between a fiction film and a documentary film? A fiction film features imagined characters through actors. A documentary film features non-actors or real living or lived experiences or subjects. A fiction film is often shot in the backdrop of a created setting. A documentary film is often shot on real locations where the events unfold unmediated. A fiction film primarily follows a prefixed written script and a storyboard. A documentary film normally does not follow a prefixed script. The plot of a fiction film is fixed before the shooting schedule. In the case of a documentary film, the plot often evolves during editing after the shooting of the real event or person. A fiction film often makes use of dubbed soundtracks created in the sound recording studio. A documentary film normally make use of soundtracks captured during the shooting itself. A fiction film is made primarily for entertainment, whereas a documentary film is made primarily to address the social political issues. A fiction film is made for profit. A documentary film is made as part of conscientization effort. A fiction film caters to the general audience, but a documentary film often serves a niche audience. A fiction film often gets released in commercial theaters. A documentary film often serves a target audience. A fiction film is generally made with a big budget. Most often, documentary films are made with a small budget. What are the various subgenres in documentary film? Patricia Afterheat classifies documentary films into 6 subcategories or types or subgenres. These categories are public affairs, government propaganda, advocacy, historical, ethnographic, and nature. Primarily depending on Patricia Afterheat's classification, let me now provide a brief description of these different types of documentary films. Public affair documentary film. Public affair documentary films express public concerns and address public issues. The methodology of investigative journalism is generally followed in such documentaries. Governmental corruption, corporate exploitation, failure of public welfare programs, breakdown of basic amenities, etc. are the staple themes of public affair documentaries. The presence of an authoritative public intellectual as the anchor, a very sober voiceover, expert commentaries providing deeper insights into the issue are the general conventions followed in public affairs or public affair documentary films. Patricia cites Banks and the Poor, 1970, directed by Morton Silverstein, as an example of public affair documentary film. Alex Gibney's Enron, The Smartest Guys in the Room, 2005, is also an example of public affair documentary film. Government propaganda documentary film. Government propaganda documentary films are produced to convince the citizens of a country about the various developmental programs of the government. Such documentaries invariably express the point of view of the political establishment or the state. Influencing public opinion is a basic purpose of any propaganda film. In India, the newsreels produced by Films Division of India are examples of government propaganda films.
Arbitration of India's political problems still remains unsolved.
Triumphs the Villains or Triumph of the Will, 1935, directed by Leni Riefenstahl, occupies the top slot among the government propaganda films produced ever. This film was made on the direction of Hitler. Let's watch an extract from Triumph of the Will. Advocacy documentary film. To create a political debate in the public sphere about a topically relevant issue is the chief aim of advocacy documentary films. Advocacy documentary films are produced to promote a particular point of view of a civil society organization. Often, such documentaries act as a counter propaganda to government-sponsored public relation films. Such documentaries try to engage the citizens in a public debate, often against the anti-people governmental policies and governmental deeds. The film Fahrenheit 9/11 2004 by Michael Moore is an advocacy documentary film. It's a cinematic critique of the foreign policy of the United States of America during the George W. Bush presidency. Vidhu Vincent's Malayalam documentary film Vrittiyude Jati, Cast of Cleanliness 2014, is an Indian advocacy documentary film about the manual scavenging which is still practiced in many parts of India. Historical documentary film. Historical documentary films are made with the definite purpose of retelling historical narratives in the audio-visual language. Historical documentaries make use of archival footages, museum exhibits, excavation sites, antique objects, photographs, paintings, remains of ancient architectural structures, etc. Expert commentary and explication is a norm in historical documentaries, providing an alternative narrative to the already existing historical interpretation of a particular historical era or event could be one of the aims of historical documentary films. Patricia cites The Fall of the Romanov Dynasty, 1927, by the Russian female filmmaker Asvir Shub as a specimen of an ideal historical documentary. Patricia puts biographic documentary films also under the umbrella category of historical documentary films. Ethnographic documentary film. Canadian filmmaker Robert Flaherty's cinematic classic Nanook of the North, 1922, is often cited as a classic example for ethnographic documentary film. Unfamiliar culture, different rituals, remote human inhabitations, human races which are not often seen in the mainstream cultural discourses are the staple subjects of ethnographic documentary films. Of course, in such films, there is an anthropological gaze exerted by the people of dominant culture on the marginalized communities and their unique lifestyles. Often, such films are accused of epistemological violence against the less vocal cultures and communities. Most of the early ethnographic films are the cultural byproducts of European colonialism. Nature documentary film. Most of the National Geographic TV channel documentaries are perfect examples of nature documentary films. In the contemporary context of global warming and discourses on sustainable life habits, nature documentary films play an important role in providing informal public education on protecting the environment. Nature documentary films are also labeled as environmental documentary films or conservationist documentary films. Animals, remote locations in the planet like the Antarctic region, the space, forests, rivers, oceans, etc. are featured often in nature documentary films. An Inconvenient Truth, 2006, directed by Davis Guggenheim, provides a fresh experience of nature documentary films.
Today, this is Mount Kilimanjaro 30 years ago and last year. Within the decade, there will be no more snows of Kilimanjaro.
Noted documentary historian and theoretician Eric Bono classifies documentary filmmakers on the basis of their general approaches to their subjects during the production of their documentary films. Of course, these approaches are later discovered by documentary theorists. Depending on the approaches, Eric Bono classifies documentary filmmakers into 14 types as follows: prophet, explorer, reporter, painter, advocate, bugler, prosecutor, poet, chronicler, promoter, observer, catalyst, guerrilla, and discoverer. To these previously mentioned categories of documentary filmmakers, based on their approaches to their subjects, Dave Saunders adds another category, the performer. India has got a rich tradition of documentary filmmakers, starting with the wrestler. We will conclude this module by mentioning a few documentary filmmakers from India like Anand Patwardhan, Paramita Vora, Rakesh Sharma, Nakul Swani, Raja Shabir Khan, Vidhu Vincent, Joshi Joseph, and so on. Theorists like John Corner argue that in the contemporary context of tele-reality shows, that we have entered into a post-documentary culture. Post-documentary culture is a culture in which many conventional elements of documentary will continue to develop, but in a radically changed setting, economic and cultural, for all audiovisual documentation. Like all cultural producers, the documentary form has always been evolving to accommodate new forms and practices which are necessary to address new issues in an ever-changing globalized socio-political climate. Let's now watch an expert dialogue on documentary film between Professor Anjali Monteiro and Professor K. Jayashankar from the Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai.
As documentary filmmakers who have had the opportunity to show our work to audiences over the years, there are some responses, some very typical responses that come at the end of a film screening which we kind of dread. The first is, does your film really show reality? The second is, what did you want to say through your film? And the third is, what is the impact of your film? I think these three responses indicate the kind of preconceived notions that most audiences have about documentary film. Documentary film is seen as some kind of a mirror to reality, something that reflects the intentions of the author and which has been made with an educational purpose to change people. I think we need to question some of these notions about documentary film, about its need to reflect a reality out there, about how it's supposed to change audiences, about it being a message in a bottle.
So the earliest known definition of documentary comes from the Canadian theoretician John Grierson, who kind of talks about documentary as a creative treatment of actuality. This formulation of the idea of documentary itself has a tension, and that tension has always plagued documentary genre even today. It has to be at once creative and it has to be actuality. Now that tension is something that is very difficult to kind of resolve. So documentary, as any other narrative, any other representational form, is an act of construction. So an interesting example that I can think of that kind of contests this idea that the camera is actually a purveyor of reality or actuality. In the book of Marquez, 100 Years of Solitude, there is one of the characters who kind of photographs each inch of a room with the kind of hope that if God existed, he will show up in one of those frames. So there is this tremendous belief in the idea of camera as a purveyor of reality and something magical that kind of is able to document unmediated reality. But as we all know, that camera is something that kind of constructs a set of realities. So what it shows, what it doesn't choose to show are also equally important.
So if one looks at the early days of this, trying to represent actuality, say a film like Nanook of the North, the earlier, sort of actuality films, the equipment was really so bulky, so heavy, so cumbersome that it was in no way possible to quote unquote capture reality. They involved a huge amount of setting up of the shot. But later, as in fact the people who were the documentary filmmakers themselves began innovating with the equipment, and you have the advent of 16 mm lightweight cameras with synchronous sound, and then this whole aspiration for documentary to become like a fly on the wall, to be an unobtrusive observer of reality came into play.
So this process of constructing a narrative, which very hard tries to kind of hide the presence of the filmmaker or even hide the presence of the camera as an unobtrusive witness of reality that's unfolding, has various implications. One is that, for example, even today many of us actually tell our subjects act normally. So it kind of brings us to the awareness that documentary film is also an act of performance where the subjects are performing themselves. It's not that it is actuality that is with no framing, so to speak.
As documentary filmmakers, as documentary viewers, I think it's very important for us to look at the documentary film as constructed and try to understand the terms of its construction, try to understand the processes of framing that are involved, not just look at documentary as some kind of a kind of story, bringing us stories from outside, but trying to understand how these stories are being framed and constructed in certain ways given the agenda of the filmmaker.
So one of the key ideas that help us interrogate this audience expectation that a documentary is unmediated reality is the idea of reflexivity. Reflexivity points to the fact that the process of construction of a narrative is available to the audience. In fictional narratives, it always remains that the process of construction is carefully hidden, and though the earlier aspiration of the documentary was to kind of elide this question of reflexivity and to kind of be an unobtrusive fly on the wall, the idea of reflexivity brings to the fore that it is a construction, it is an act of framing, it is also an ideological signifying practices where the author is kind of framing a particular event, what the fly sees and what the fly refuses to see and include in the construction is also significant. So reflexivity is not a formal device. Reflexivity is a stance which kind of, as Peter Wolin interestingly puts it, it could reflexivity could manifest itself as a questioning of the materiality of the cinematic signifier at one level, which means that it constantly subverts this idea of the audience expectation that the image actually represents a reality out there. Also, it could be questioning the materiality of the social praxis that it's engaged in.
In fact, there are films that might not be sort of formally very reflexive, but are what we could call politically reflexive. They question the materiality of the social praxis, they question the normality of the everyday, and a lot of the films in the Indian context, what we call the so-called political documentaries, are in fact doing that.
So the historical juncture at which Grierson deploys this term documentary film, it was a time when it's a post-war reconstruction, depression, the Great Depression, and the attempt was to kind of use documentary form as a mode of social education. There could be issues of civil society, there could be issues of citizenship, there could be issues of nationhood. So these were some of the themes that was handled, and the role of documentary in these processes were seen as more as an educational enterprise. And also in India, when it emerged, it was largely almost exclusively state sponsored, where as a new nation the documentary form was thought of as something that would change perceptions, be part of this whole nation building process.
I think today this whole question of impact is something that most documentary filmmakers would question, and rather than seeing the documentary as some kind of a tool that you use to convince somebody of your ideas, I think most documentary filmmakers would see the text that they produce as some kind of an invitation to a dialogue. The idea is that a documentary raises questions, offers a space for discussion, and maybe creates a space that where the filmmakers as well as the audience can question the safe spaces that they come from.
Therefore, the idea that documentary is for a less powerful other, constructed by people who are had access, privileges and access to knowledge, is something that needs to be questioned, and that brings us to the question of the politics of representation itself.
One could also look at this whole idea of the politics of representation from the point of view of the relationship of power or the flows of power between the filmmaker and their subjects. Because who has the right to decide how the story is told? How do we see the question of consent? How do we? What are the kind of cinematic conventions that perhaps sometimes in the interest of a story that is watchable ends up turning subjects into victims rather than giving them agency or giving them dignity. So I think these questions of how do we relate to our subjects, and then how do we translate that relationship in the cinematic text, how do we construct the relationship of the audience to our subjects through the cinematic text. I think this is something that many of us as documentary filmmakers are acutely aware of today. And so the whole question of both the politics of representation as well as the ethics of representation, I think, are very much to the fore. And I think many filmmakers are looking critically at their own presence, at their own relationship with their subjects, many subjects, given the changes in technology that have taken place, I think many subjects themselves are picking up cameras and trying to tell their own stories. So the entire ecosystem within which documentary film works, the kind of traditional notions of documentary as someone who has certain privileges, who calls the shots, who makes stories about others, who does this with an aim to change people's perceptions, and who's sort of trying to reflect a reality out there. I think all these different kinds of relationships are today being questioned in a state of flux, and this reflects in the documentary form itself, which has become or which has been in fact a very varied creature. Documentary itself becomes very difficult today to define or to classify, and even the lines between what is documentary and what is fiction are getting increasingly blurred.
Yeah, but one of the issues that we would like to flag is that there's a very large body of Indian documentary work. So there is, unfortunately, in the Indian context, there is a lack of documentary viewing culture. In other countries, there are channels that devoted, television channels that are devoted to documentary film, but here there is opportunities are very, very few, in spite of which there's a large body of work that's being produced. So what we need to do is to kind of make documentaries available, and of course what stands in between documentaries and the audience is the fact that documentaries, the very fact that they're political, the very fact that they speak truth to power kind of comes in the way of their distribution.
In fact, I think as documentary filmmakers, particularly in the Indian context, we have to contend with various regimes of censorship. There is, of course, the censorship of the state, where if you want to have any public distribution of your work, you have to get clearance from the Central Board of Film Certification. And if you manage to get past that, then there is the censorship of the market, where television channels are not really interested in showing documentaries, or there's no cinematic distribution, virtually no cinematic distribution of documentaries. And then of course there's a third kind of censorship, which is the kind of vigilante censorship that a lot of documentaries face. So really I think it's an uphill kind of task for documentary filmmakers to distribute their work. But despite this, I would say that the documentary scene in India is still kind of very vibrant. There's a lot of work being produced, and the shifts in technology also have reduced the costs of production. The internet has opened up new possibilities for distribution. So I do think that the documentary as a form is alive and kicking, and is something that has played a significant role in the public sphere in India.